This is a variety show that will never be introduced in China, but is a global sensation. Contestants don't need to sing karaoke or perform parkour. They just need to sit there and answer 21 questions honestly, to win a reward of $500,000. However, since the show began airing, only one contestant has won the grand prize. The vast majority of contestants face social death after the show airs, with some even developing severe depression or directly leading to violent incidents. Today, we will discuss a tragic case that resulted from participating in the show. The main character of this tragedy is a Peruvian girl named Ruth Talia Sayas, who was under 20 years old. Her reason for participating was simple. Due to her family's poor financial condition, she wanted to raise money to open a hair salon and improve her family's life with her skills. When she appeared on the show, she was filled with hope, greeting her parents and boyfriend Brian, who were seated in the audience. She saw this day as a turning point that would change her fate. Indeed, it turned out to be so, but in a direction she hadn't anticipated. Let's first look at Ruth's support team. Her parents, though poor, have always loved their daughter and supported her in pursuing her dreams. They were happy to see their daughter trying to give back to the family. Brian Romero, who had been in a relationship with Ruth for several years, had plans to marry her once they reached a certain age. Everyone believed Ruth was a pure and kind girl who would surely win the prize and start a better life. Soon, the Q&A began. At first, the questions were easy and trivial, such as whether she had ever skipped school or would return money if she found it. Although these questions might touch on personal ethics, most people are not perfect, and it's unreasonable to be too harsh on others. Ruth's willingness to honestly express her thoughts in public was a sign of sincerity and courage. Thus, she answered the first 5 questions with ease. From her expression, it was clear that if all the questions were like this, she would surely strive for the top prize. But would things really go that smoothly? Despite knowing Ruth was unlikely to quit at this point, the host still routinely asked if she wanted to continue, and of course, Ruth said yes. Thus began her torment. The first question of the second round struck Ruth deeply. Do you feel happy at home? For those watching, if someone asked you this question in front of your parents, how would you answer? Under normal circumstances, most people would answer happy without hesitation. But Ruth's situation was different. She wanted to win the prize and was hooked up to a lie detector. Her sudden change in expression betrayed her thoughts. After some hesitation, Ruth admitted she was not happy. For those unfamiliar with lie detectors, here's a brief introduction. A lie detector doesn't directly determine whether you are lying, but is designed to measure physiological responses that most people cannot control. When lying, especially on significant issues, people might experience accelerated breathing, increased heart rate, elevated blood pressure, or more sweating. The lie detector measures these parameters. To be more accurate, the machine is calibrated with baseline data from questions that are impossible to lie about, such as your name and gender. Significant deviations in these parameters indicate deception. However, the machine is ineffective for those trained to deceive and is not legally binding. For Ruth at that moment, she simply couldn't lie, and this honest answer was just the beginning of her nightmare. Although her parents might occasionally sense dissatisfaction with their family's situation, seeing their daughter give such an answer was awkward. The subsequent questions only made them feel worse. The second question was, do you feel embarrassed by having such parents and a family? This question can be seen as an escalation of the previous one. While occasional complaints about family conditions are somewhat common, feeling ashamed of one's family is a much more severe issue. After all, there's a saying in our country, a son doesn't disdain his mother's ugliness, and a dog doesn't despise its poor home, meaning you shouldn't despise your origins, as they are beyond your control. Although such a concept might not exist abroad, parents certainly don't want their children to feel ashamed of them. Judging by Ruth's pained expression, it was unclear whether her answer would further hurt her parents. Indeed, after a longer period of hesitation, Ruth gave a definitive answer. She did feel that her parents were holding her back and considered being born into such an environment to be shameful. Although we don't know the details of Ruth's upbringing, from the sight of her mother crying while covering her face and her father's angry expression, it's evident that Ruth's life might have been quite difficult, leading her to have such negative feelings about her family. After answering this question, it seemed Ruth might have been contemplating quitting, but the host's next question rekindled some hope. The next question was, if your parents were seriously ill and required you to exhaust all your financial resources to treat them, would you be willing? Ruth answered without any hesitation, saying she would be willing. From her reasons for participating in the show, it was clear that despite her complaints, Ruth still loved her family and wanted to improve their lives. Hearing this, her parents' expressions softened a bit. With the second set of questions completed, Ruth had won about $5,000 so far. At this point, she didn't know that the remaining questions wouldn't be so easy to answer. Although the show's goal is to reveal the deepest secrets of the participants, the host repeatedly emphasized that the upcoming questions would involve personal privacy and might be difficult to answer. Ruth was asked if she wanted to continue. Even though she had already won some money, it was still not enough for her to open the hair salon she wanted. She needed much more, so after some hesitation, she chose to continue, thereby entering a true hellish scenario. In the third stage, the first question was explosive. Have you betrayed your current partner? When this question was asked, the first person to be shocked wasn't Ruth, but Brian, who was sitting in the audience. He had never expected that the show's insistence on his presence was because the questions would involve him. At this moment, Brian was as nervous as Ruth. If Ruth gave an answer he didn't want, it would not only mean the end of their relationship but would also publicly embarrass him. As the camera focused on both Brian and Ruth, the atmosphere in the room and among the viewers was charged with anticipation. With Ruth's hesitant response, the atmosphere became electric, and both Brian and Ruth's faces turned dark. Though they hadn't communicated yet, they both knew their relationship was over. However, the show's team and host clearly felt it wasn't enough and poured salt into the freshly opened wound. The next question was, if a better quality man pursued you, would you abandon your current boyfriend for him? Even though the previous question had already been uncomfortable, the show's team asked this hypothetical question, which seemed to imply, are you just playing with Brian? You never intended to marry him and would leave him for a better option. With such a direct and probing question, Ruth had no chance to lie. How would she respond? The answer was clear. Ruth expressed her true feelings. She would indeed abandon her current boyfriend for a better option. As soon as she said this, Brian was already struggling to hold back his tears. He had come thinking that today would lay the foundation for their future happiness, only to watch their beautiful past crumble before him. Though Ruth was the one answering the questions on stage, Brian felt as if he was the one enduring the torment. With the questions reaching such a level, Brian even considered leaving, but the show's team insisted he stay, telling him there were more important things to come. The host then showed a final act of mercy, asking Ruth if she wanted to quit answering questions. The upcoming questions might cause her to lose Brian completely. However, Ruth was determined to win the money and saw quitting as a waste of what she had already endured. Thus, she chose to continue, even though the next question was, have you secretly used medication to avoid getting pregnant by your current boyfriend? At this point, Ruth had given up on any pretense. She didn't hesitate and answered affirmatively. Brian, on the other hand, was at a loss for words. In front of a national audience, he had gone from a happy fiancé to a nationally infamous figure. The rapid and immense impact of this blow left him somewhat numb, just wanting to see what other secrets about Ruth would come to light. The third stage ended with Ruth having accumulated $10,000. She was unsure whether to stop, feeling that she had already endured enough or if she should push further, as the host had warned that continuing might result in losing all her winnings. Nevertheless, Ruth decided to press on, aiming for a higher prize. At this point, it seemed Ruth had underestimated the show's ability. She thought her well-hidden secrets were safe, but the show's team knew everything. In the fourth round, the first question was, would your parents be proud of your real job? Ruth's face immediately changed. She hadn't expected that her most concealed secret would be revealed. Her parents, confused, couldn't understand why, after the brutal questions of the previous round, the show would suddenly ask such a simple question. Their daughter was just a night shift worker at a supermarket. While it might not be a source of pride, it wasn't something with a standard answer. Seeing Ruth's changing expressions, her parents felt that their understanding of their daughter might not be as accurate as they thought. After some hesitation, Ruth slowly admitted that her parents wouldn't be proud. She regretted her hasty decision because, once the new phase began, if she didn't answer all the questions, she would lose the money she had already won. Lying was not an option. Ruth knew the upcoming questions could impact her family, but she had no choice but to hope for some leniency from the show's team, wishing they would not ask about things she wanted to keep private. However, it was clear that the show's team might do anything but show mercy. The second question was, do you actually work in nightclubs every day? Ruth lost all hope. She knew the show's team had already uncovered her hidden secrets, and she wasn't sure if it was panic or something else, but after answering, she added a lot of explanations. She emphasized that she was just a regular dancer working in nightclubs for the money, but her income was earned honestly, and she wasn't involved in any illicit activities. Though Ruth was trying hard to defend herself, to her parents and the audience, her extensive explanation before the host had even asked the question seemed suspect. What else was she hiding? Just as Ruth was about to continue defending herself, the host interrupted her and asked a question that would shatter her life. Have you slept with others to make money? Ruth completely broke down. If she didn't answer, everyone, her parents, her boyfriend, and the national audience, would assume she had done it. If she lied, it would be even worse. Was telling the truth any better? In this difficult situation, if it were me, I would also choose to answer honestly to protect the money I had already earned. Otherwise, all the previous suffering would be in vain. Ruth did just that. She confirmed the truth, though she added a powerless defense afterward, saying she had only engaged in such transactions a few times when she desperately needed money. However, such a defense seemed futile. Fortunately, this was the last question of the round, and after answering it, Ruth immediately chose to take the money and leave. At this point, the prize money was $15,000, which might have been enough for Ruth to realize her dream of opening a hair salon. But could she truly continue with a normal life? What about her family? Soon, Ruth experienced the world's cruelty and realized just how unwise her initial decision was. Why had she been foolish enough to use public secrets as a means to earn money? Now, whenever she went out, most people would point and whisper about her. Given that Peru's population is just over 30 million and the show's revelations were of national interest, nearly everyone had seen it. While Ruth could attempt to ignore the glances from strangers, the harassment from local thugs and the estrangement from once close friends made it impossible for her to maintain a normal life. What she didn't yet realize was the depth of revenge she would face from those she had hurt the most. The time was September 2012. On a morning when Ruth hoped to get some fresh air before the streets became crowded, she vanished without a trace. That night, her parents, unable to reach her, discovered her phone was also turned off. As it was already late, they decided to investigate the next day. Since the airing of the show, not only had Ruth faced disdain, but her family had also been talked about. Neighbors speculated that Ruth might be out making money, given her recent behavior. Faced with this situation, Ruth's parents could only continue their own inquiries. Soon, Ruth's parents learned from one of her classmates, one of the few who had stayed in touch with Ruth after the show, that Ruth had indeed gone out to talk with her. However, Ruth had received a call from Brian and left abruptly afterward. Ruth's parents realized something might have gone wrong. Following the show, Ruth and Brian had naturally broken up, but Brian too had become a national joke. His former occupation as a taxi driver meant that every passenger now looked at him with knowing smiles, and some even made derisive comments. This made it impossible for him to continue working normally, and the blow had caused him to become increasingly despondent and withdrawn. Ruth's parents quickly found Brian and confronted him, hoping he could provide information about their daughter. However, Brian coldly claimed he didn't know anything. Ruth's parents were convinced that Brian must have harmed Ruth and begged him, saying they would accept whatever happened to their daughter. Yet, Brian mercilessly kept them out. With no other options, Ruth's parents had to place their last hope in the local police. To their dismay, the police showed disdain for Ruth's profession and suggested that her absence was not unusual for someone in her line of work, advising her parents to wait at home. Enraged by this attitude, Ruth's parents contacted the media, hoping to leverage public opinion to find their daughter. While they succeeded in drawing media attention, both the press and the public seemed more interested in the spectacle than in genuinely helping. Despite the renewed public scrutiny, no useful clues emerged until 10 days later when a passerby reported finding a body in an old house on the outskirts of town. The police confirmed it was Ruth, who had been missing for some time. There was no doubt that Brian was the perpetrator. When apprehended, he confessed to the crime. The motive was less about Ruth humiliating him on national television and more about her callousness. After Brian had lost his job as a driver, he had fallen into poverty and sought out Ruth, not to reconcile, but to ask for a share of the prize money, which he felt he had earned through his own humiliation. Ruth had flatly refused, which drove Brian's accumulated resentment to the breaking point. Although Brian confessed to the crime, police evidence suggested additional complications. They found large amounts of sleeping pills in Ruth's blood and stomach. Since sleeping pills are prescription drugs requiring purchase records, and Brian had none, but his uncle had bought a large quantity shortly before the incident, and the abandoned house where Ruth was found belonged to Brian's uncle, the police concluded that both uncle and nephew were involved in the crime. Brian, facing a life he no longer cared for, took all the blame. After extensive questioning, both the uncle and nephew admitted to conspiring to murder Ruth. Since the details of the case were well known throughout Peru, the trial court repeatedly asked Brian if he felt remorse. If Brian had shown any sign of regret, the judge might have considered a lighter sentence. However, Brian seemed to have given up on life, and his uncle found little reason to continue without him. Both men stated they did not regret their actions and would kill Ruth again if given the chance. The judge had no choice but to sentence them to life imprisonment. Unexpectedly, the verdict sparked public outrage. After the sentencing of Brian and his uncle, many people across the country petitioned and voiced their opinions online, arguing that Brian was initially a victim who had been pushed to the edge. In 2021, the case was retried, and their sentences were reduced to over 30 years, with the possibility of early release for good behavior. Given their time already served, they might be out in a few years. However, even if they were released, the question remains, would they ever be able to return to a normal life?